After 29 years of uninterrupted growth, has the coronavirus caused Australia to enter a recession?
The answer to that is yes.
The much anticipated growth figures for the first 3 months of 2020, revealing the economy shrank by 0.3%, taking annual growth down with it to 1.4%.
One looks back on the March quarter and there wasn't much good news.
And that news will only get worse with the full impact of coronavirus restrictions to smash growth in the June quarter.
The economic impact will be severe, far more severe than what we have seen today.
At the height of the health crisis, Treasury indicated GDP could drop by more than 20% in the June quarter.
What we were facing was an economist's version of Armageddon.
But thanks to the National Cabinet's early mark ushering in restriction relief across Australia, the pandemic pain isn't as bad as first feared.
In the face of a 1 in 100-year global pandemic, the Australian economy has been remarkably resilient.
Well, it's not resilient for the Australians who've lost their jobs. It's not resilient enough for those Australians who've joined the unemployment queues.
The Treasurer has pushed back his economic update from June to July to coincide with the JobKeeper review. While there's no decision yet, Josh Frydenberg providing a hint on possible changes to the $70 billion wage subsidy plan.
We want to understand whether the quantum, that $1,500 payment, continues to be the right amount, also bearing in mind that some people are getting paid more than they would otherwise get.
Having introduced this support too slowly and too narrowly, they shouldn't withdraw it too quickly and too bluntly.
The Morrison government is banking on its industrial relations reform agenda to ramp up the economic recovery. And it's wasting no time kicking off discussions with 5 working groups to meet regularly over the next 4 months.
Today's meeting, I think, demonstrated the level of good faith and optimism.
The Business Council says CEOs need a voice at the table.
The big supermarkets in respect of the awards, the companies that have a lot of casual labour.
While the ACTU has laid out its red lines.
We want to see Australian workers get fair pay rises. We want to see a country where people have basic job security.
The IR Minister praising the spirit of cooperation, but it doesn't extend to everyone.
People on construction sites who have been behaving in an unlawful way, dial it the hell down.
The union-busting ensuring integrity laws shelved, but the tough rhetoric remains. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Right, there's a lot to unpack from the Treasurer's announcement today. Joining me now to make sense of it all, former Reserve Bank official and former Chief Economist to the Prime Minister, Dr Andrew Stone in Sydney. Andrew, you know, of course, in technical terms, we're not in a recession yet, but there's no doubt we are in one in practical terms. While negative territory today in the March quarter, we've fared much better than other economies overseas. What did you make out of the data today? And if you were back advising the PM, where would you tell him to put the focus from here on in?
It is true that we did do much better in the March quarter than other economies, but nevertheless the economy did contract 0.3%, as you said. We also had a number of other impacts besides just the Wuhan virus crisis. We had the bushfires and the ongoing drought. So all things considered, it's in some ways less bad than it might have been. On the other hand, as you pointed out, the impact in the June quarter will be vastly bigger. We know from data, for example, that the ABS has been putting out, it's been quite fleet of foot in putting out much more up-to-date data on jobs. And we know that the big fall in the number of people receiving, being employed and receiving a wage occurred in very late March and through to the middle of April. So whereas there'd been about a 1% decline by late, in response to the effects of the virus, by late March, there had been about an 8% decline already by the middle of April. So the big thing to take out of that is that, first of all, we are definitely going to have a recession. There's going to be a big fall in GDP in the June quarter. But actually, we're still only 2/3 of the way through the June quarter. And the big thing is we can make that fall considerably less severe by accelerating dramatically the opening up of the economy. A point I made a couple of weeks ago on the show was that we've now been going for a month and a half where the number of new cases of the virus has been less than 1 per million Australians per day. In a situation like that, and where the number of deaths, we've had 102 deaths from the virus. In 2018, the number of deaths from flu and pneumonia was over 3,100 in the course of the year. In the space of 3 months, we've had 100-odd deaths from this virus. In those circumstances, it makes no sense at all that we continue to have any restrictions whatsoever on economic activity. And if we start getting rid of those, then we can start encouraging people back to work. We can get people who are currently employed but idle, being supported by government payments, working again. In particular, the mad talk about maintaining closure of state borders in places like Queensland and many of the states, which is destroying our tourism industry. If we get rid of those, then we can make the fall in the June quarter. It's going to be severe no matter what we do now, but we can make it a lot less severe, and that's the key thing we need to do right away.
All right, Andrew, today Jim Chalmers was the Chief of Staff, I might add, to Wayne Swan, now the Finance Shadow Minister for Labor. He was out there today. He had this to say. Let's have a listen.
Now, the Treasurer says that Australia was headed for a cliff. But what he fails to recognise is that Australians are headed for another cliff in September when this government support that's in the economy is withdrawn suddenly by the government.
Right, what's your view on the government extending some of these payments like JobKeeper past September, or at least staggering the drop-off of a number of these various payments so they don't all occur at the same time? What's your view?
My view is it would make absolutely no sense whatsoever to continue them beyond September. In fact, they ought to be moving more aggressively than they are, though Josh Frydenberg was hinting towards this. They ought to be moving more aggressively to wind them back. Again, another way to put the fact that we have, it turns out, massively overreacted to this virus economically is to say the Prime Minister, when he spoke to the Press Club a number of days ago, talked about having accrued costs in terms of increased debt already of $150 billion, when, as I say, we've had 102 deaths here. So you're talking about spending of more than $1 billion, $1.5 billion per death that has occurred from this virus. In those circumstances, the idea that we should be talking about continuing these payments on beyond the 6-month period that we will have arrived at roughly in September makes no sense at all. We need to be winding these back. We need to be getting people back to work. People would much rather be back at work than on a government handout. And it's essential that we do that because all of that debt is debt that Australians will be having to repay 10, 20 years from now. That's less money available for hospitals over the next decade, over the decade after that. That's less money available for schools over the next decade and the decade after that. So we can't just spend money now and then forget about what the consequences of that will be for many years to come.
Yeah, we know from that report yesterday, we're talking about 35 years, and you can't imagine that hospital technologies, that the things we'll need for our kids in the education system to stay where they should be against their counterparts overseas, that we're not going to spend anything other than just maintain funding for 35 years, or defence equipment, God forbid, for 35 years. This will be the challenge. Andrew Stone, thank you for your analysis tonight.
Thanks, Peter.